Hello and welcome to this video and to January's book review. Apologies if you can hear any background noise. Pete's computer is actually quite loud now, so that will be whirring in the background. But on to the books, or the reading in the month itself. I have read 9 books, 4 of those were graphic novels, so that's obviously why there's quite that number, and the graphic novels are a series, so we'll talk about those together. First, I thought I would share with you my plans for reading in 2022, because obviously the last book review we did was wrapping up the year 2021. So for 2022 I'm aiming to get to 52 books read. I surpassed that last year, but I've never reached that kind of number before. Last year was the first year, so I'm aiming for 52, see if we can go further. And I have set myself a couple of things that I have to tick off every month. So last year obviously I had the classic and the non-fiction. This year I want to make sure I read at least one book on my Kindle every month, because there's an awful lot of books on there that I won't prioritise if I don't set that as a thing to do every month. And I'd like to reread something every month, because I have all these books, most of them I've only read once, and there's a number that I want to revisit and go back to. The third is not really one, but is one. I'd still like to try and get to one non-fiction book a month, but I'm going to do that oh, apologies for my voice, but I'm going to do that as long as I have non-fiction books. I'm not going to go out of my way to do it, but as I have a few floating around on my shelves and on my Kindle, I'm going to still do that. There is no double ups on those though, so if I read a non-fiction on my Kindle I still have to read a book on my Kindle. That is my rules for myself. So yeah, that's the plan for 2022, and we now may as well talk about the books that I read in January. And I started with one that is quite outside of my comfort zone. It was actually lent to me by Pete's auntie, and that was Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. So this is, I think the class is dark academia, could have elements of fantasy I guess, and it follows Piranesi, who lives in the house, which is essentially like a labyrinth, and he is learning all about the different statues and the different windiness until he comes across a note, which then throws a lot of things into disarray as he starts trying to work out who he was and where he is and all of that kind of stuff. Now I have to say for this one that the first maybe 150 pages I didn't have a clue what was going on. If I wasn't so stubborn I would have stopped reading it, although Susanna Clarke's writing is very good and it's very descriptive. I was so disorientated and so lost with the story that I was getting kind of frustrated. Thankfully it's quite a short book, so I did carry on, and then in the last sort of 50-60 pages things actually started happening and things started to be pulled together, and it made a lot more sense and it was a lot more enjoyable. So in the end I did give this something like I think 3 stars or 3.5 stars, just because of that last 50-60 pages. If it hadn't had that it would have been like a 1. So I guess if you're going to read this one, go into it knowing that the beginning is really quite confusing, but it does come together, so it is worth sticking with, which is why I always stick with books. I'm a bit annoyed that it did it, because DNFing, if I could get into the habit of that, would help with some of the reading, but that's a tangent that I don't need to go down. So it's written in sort of diary entries. It's kind of a unreliable narrator slightly, because he doesn't actually know who he was and stuff like that. But yeah, just a bit of a disorientating time, but I think I enjoyed it. So yeah, that was Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. We then come on to the graphic novels, which as I said I'm going to talk about as the series and as the 4 books, and that is of course the Hearstoppers, which part of me feels I don't need to explain because everybody seems to have read these and I seem to be very, very late to the party. But if you're unaware, it is a graphic novel by Oseman, and it follows Nick, who is who's been outed at school, the beginnings of his friendship and relationship with Charlie, who is your typical sports lad, nobody thinks he would ever be gay, that kind of thing. All of them together are really good, and because they're graphic novels they don't take very long to read at all. I think I read all of them in about an hour, maybe the fourth one slightly longer because it is much chunkier, but they don't take long at all, and the illustrations are really cool. I particularly like parts with Nick's dog just because of how accurate they are. So there was a part where they took it for a walk and they're chatting away over here, and then there's just a little image of the dog rolling on its back in the grass, which is what Jeff does quite a lot. So I did like those little touches, and the story itself is just adorable. Nick and Charlie make a really, such a weak word, but nice couple, and one that you're really rooting for as they go along, and well worth the hype that these receive. I've never read a graphic novel before, but figured I would probably enjoy the story, so wanted to give it a go, and yeah, well worth a punt if you're looking to dip your toe into the graphic novel world and you're into sort of high school romances, I guess. To give you a quick synopsis of the four, number one is obviously them meeting. Number two is more about Charlie coming out. Number three is all about a school trip to Paris, where their relationship is building. And volume four is more about a look at mental health and the support and stuff people can do for that. So they do touch on some big themes, and I do think it's quite a good representation of the LGBTQIA plus community, because you not only have the gay love interest at the centre of this, but their friends are also highly part of that community as well, which did lead me to one thing that I wasn't quite so sure about. Yes, I love the fact that everything is represented really well in this, and quite rightly so, because there isn't a lot of representation in fiction, although it is getting better, of that community. But all the people that they come across sort of adult-wise who are supportive, other than maybe Charlie's parents, are all also part of that community, which did make me wonder whether, if you are of that age, struggling with that element of your sexuality, whether you're going to start thinking that most adults aren't going to be supportive. I know there will be a few that won't, because not everybody's story is positive. So those are the four books of the Hearstopper. I believe the last and fifth one comes out this year, and yes, as I said, well worth a read. I then came to my reread for the month, and I reread 13 Dates by Matt Dunn. This follows Noah on his quest to make Angel fall in love with him by going on 13 dates. I didn't really remember anything about this book, which is why I wanted to reread it, because I always look at it when I do my unhauls and think, why am I keeping it? I don't remember this book. So I thought, reread it and then we'll work out whether we want to keep or unhaul it. What I liked about it is that it's a romance but from a male perspective, which is not something that you see very often, or at least not ones that I see very often, just because of the types of books that I pick up. But I would say that Noah can come across as a bit stalkerish, and Angel is that sort of stereotypical kooky kind of women. So there is a lot of stereotypes in this that make it slightly less enjoyable, but actually this isn't really a fluffy romance novel, which I thought it was. Going back into it and rereading, there's a lot of topics around health that are covered in this, and makes it far more enjoyable than I expected, in fact. I also love the fact that Noah is a complete and utter overthinker like me, so I could relate to a lot of that overthinking that he was going through in his quest to get Angel to fall in love with him. On the whole, surprised me, even though I have read it before, but it surprised me because it had a lot more heart and a lot more depth to it. So that was 13 Dates by Matt Dunn. I then read my Kindle pick of the month, and that was Sister Swap by Fiona Collins. This probably wouldn't have been the book that I would have picked to read this month, but I found it for free on the Kindle store when I was looking through my I want to read this book list, looking for things to put on my birthday list, and was a bit worried that because it was free it was going to get taken off my Kindle, because something like that has happened before. I don't really know why and I haven't looked into it, so I thought just read that one first and then we won't have to worry about it. This follows two sisters. They have an age gap of, I believe, about 10 years, and the older sister had to come back and leave her career in London when the younger sister was 16 and their parents died in a car crash. So there's a lot of resentment to it. But this story is based several years later, where they don't talk anymore, and the younger sister is told by the doctor that she has to relax, and advises her to get out of London, and the older sister gets a month's contract with the old company that she used to work with in events in London. So even though they don't talk, they come together and they decide to swap lives, swap houses essentially, so that they don't have to communicate with each other. And as you know, it's all going to come together that they end up talking and making up, because that's how these things always work. And this one was very predictable. You knew where it was going, you knew what was going to happen. It's had all of the same tropes of that kind of novel, and it hit them at the same points, and it just wasn't very enjoyable, I guess. It was fine, but I've read so many better books that use that kind of concept. I mean, I read The Switch last year, which was one of my favourites. Okay, I know it's a grandmother and a granddaughter and they get on, but that is switching lives, one going to the countryside, one going to London, and it was just done so much better than this one. Where the issue was is that the things didn't interlink. You had this story and you had this story and you had this story, and there was never really much that interlinked them and drew them all together. So when you got to the conclusion of the book, it just fell flat, because you didn't really have any connection to the past and each story. They were just there, I guess. Positives: the writing is quite good, the pacing is quite good, it wasn't overly long or overly short, but yeah, it was just too predictable and too... I don't know when it was published, but it felt like it was a good decade ago. And we've moved on a lot in that type of fiction from where that book is. So probably my least favourite book of the month. I think I gave it something like 2.5 stars in the end. Just wanted to get it read and over and done with, to be quite fair. So that was Sister Swap by Fiona Collins. As I mentioned, I'm still trying to get some non-fiction into my month's reading. So I read When Breath Becomes Air by Kalanithi. This is a memoir written by Paul, who has been studying to be a neurologist or a neurosurgeon, for years, obviously, and as he's coming to the end of that training, he is then diagnosed with inoperable lung cancer. So I expected this book to be quite hard-hitting. I also expected it to look a lot at the relationship of being the doctor being the patient, and how you could go in between the two. And it was sort of like that, but actually it was a look at death. He just has a lot of interest in death itself, and he really took that in when he was diagnosed and was looking at whether the impact he's made in his life is good, what happens afterwards, should he be doing this, that and the other, and that kind of thing. It wasn't quite as much of that tussle between knowing what's going on and being a patient and allowing others to look after you and stuff, which is what I was expecting. Obviously it does cover some quite tough topics, but it's actually written really well. The only way I can really describe it is lyrical, but I'm not sure that's the word I actually want to use to describe it. But as I say, very well written, and there are elements of it, certainly when he's talking about some of the operations, that are quite visceral, which again may be the wrong word, but it's the one I'm going with. This is sort of split up into two sections, where the beginning is more about the training of becoming a doctor and a neurosurgeon, and then the second part is about his illness. Sorry, I've just kicked the tripod. I mean, I knew it wouldn't be for me anyway, but training to be a doctor sounds horrid. I don't like it at all. It just sounds really, really tough, and I do think you can't go into it for anything other than the fact that you're called to do it, I guess. And lastly on this, poor Kalanithi died before it was published, before it was technically finished, I guess, and his wife Lucy wrote just the best epilogue I think I've ever written to this, ever read to this kind of book, and it couldn't have been easy for her, but it was probably my favourite part of the book, to be honest, so did want to bring that one to your attention as well. So did enjoy it. I'd say not quite what I was expecting, but still a really, really interesting read. So that was When Breath Becomes Air by Paul Kalanithi. And we've come to the last one, and I really fancied reading sort of a thriller, murder mystery kind of thing, so I went with The Cheerleaders by Cara Thomas. If you've seen my book haul from the end of the year, I mean a lot of these are in that anyway, but this was one of the charity shop finds. It's the one with the slight water damage at the top. And this follows Monica, whose sister 5 years ago committed suicide, and she was like the 5th of the group of cheerleaders to die. 2 died in a car crash and 2 were murdered, and then she committed suicide, and obviously that has rocked the small community that they're in, but also Monica's family itself. So 5 years on, Monica finds some information and then starts to look into the case some more, as she believes that there are a lot of people that know things that haven't been saying things. I really enjoyed this. I think it was a touch too long. I think we could have taken maybe like 30 pages out, 40 pages out, and it would have been that perfect pace, because there was a patch where I was losing interest just before we got to the resolution part of it. So I think we could have taken just a little bit out of it just to keep that pace going. But it was a twisty book. I didn't really see anything coming. I'm not one to really look for the killer, the whatever, in this case the killer, but I was shocked when I found out who it was. It wasn't where I thought it was going to go. I wouldn't say it was particularly like gasp worthy, that you couldn't believe that it had happened and you have to carry on because what's going to happen next, but it was good. Maybe a little convenient in places, but I did enjoy it, and it is a very easy book to read. I actually particularly preferred the chapters from Jennifer, who is the sister that committed suicide, from that 5-year period, from 5 years ago, in the lead up to that event. I must say, I say she committed suicide, that's one of the questions in the book, so you'd have to read it to find out whether it was suicide or not. But yeah, but I did really enjoy those. I liked knowing the sort of background to it, and it is interesting to see the 5 victims, I guess, in this book, and it from that perspective. But yeah, I did enjoy it. Certainly scratched that sort of thriller murder mystery itch that I had, and I wouldn't mind picking up some more from this author because I did enjoy this book quite a bit. So there we go, the end of my January book review wrap up thing. As I say, because of the graphic novels, that's why we had so many books this month. I'm not expecting to hit similar numbers, but we'll see. Still really, really enjoying reading, and as you can see, lots of books, because that is double stacked over here of books to read. So if you're interested in seeing what I think of whatever I read next month, I don't really have a plan. Probably easygoing stuff because I know I've got a tricky month at work. Please hit that subscribe button to come along for the ride. And if you've enjoyed this one in particular, please give it a thumbs up, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!